My question for Dan, and I guess anyone, is how often you are jigging everything up for when you're doing a refret and planing the board on the jig or planing the board off the jig. Then that's my question. How often?
Dan, you want to start?
I do the whole job in the jig. Level it, clean the slots, fret it, then level it, crown it, then string it up. And the glory thing is when you string it up sometimes, and if you have a peg head jack on it, if that falls out, when you tilt it over, and if it's in tune, you feel really good. You can control the neck that much sometimes, especially a bad neck, or one without a truss rod.
Maybe the thing to do is to have like a little confessional here where people that have used it say the percentage that they've used it. I have a neck jig and I've used it once. Sean, do you want to go? You want to go next?
Yeah, we use the neck jig for probably 90% of fret levels. We plane every single board for a refret in the jig.
Mm-hmm.
And we do put fall away in with the jig as well. And that's about it. Like pretty much all fret work is done on the jig. We don't always fret in the jig.
So driving the frets in is outside of the jig, correct?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of times. Oh, sorry. I'm over here. I mowed the lawn.
What are you doing? What are you doing over there?
I look like shit. I just mowed the lawn. So I stink and I don't want to be like too close to anybody. Yeah, so a lot of the times I'll pull the frets outside of the jig. Jig it up, plane the board to where I think it's good, take it back out of the jig, and then I usually press everything in, and I usually use either a drill press or an arbor press for that.
Yeah.
Sometimes the jaws, but I for whatever reason it's not comfortable for me to do that in the neck jig. So I'll do that back at my bench, and then I will string it back, make a nut, string it back up, and then finish everything in the jig.
Okay. Doug Proper, what's your over under for using neck jigs?
I'm probably at about 40 to 45% of guitars being done in the jig for levels and crowns. Probably 50% of the fret, the board leveling takes place on a refret in the jig. Almost all of my fretting is taking place outside of the jig because I'm hammering things in, and the jig doesn't really lend itself to having something swung at it.
Yeah.
So, and then sometimes I'll get things leveled off in the jig and then just crown out of it because I can just go over to my crowning bench and get out of the way. Plus, I can get in and out of the neck jig faster that way. But probably all of the fender necks that I'll do in the neck jig because I just like to be able to clamp it to a surrogate body and then clamp that to the jig, so rather than having a light neck being, on the bench, but
flopping around. Yeah.
Yeah. And then plus, I probably press in the frets on the drill press on fender necks, probably for about 60 to 70% of those anyway. So they go right back in the jig after that. But as far as deciding which guitars the jig is going to be used for and which aren't, I let the guitars on the front end of things tell me which is the candidate for the jig, and comparing how the neck reacts to string tension versus not, when you get that deflection of like say a Martin style guitar where you're getting a rise in the shoulders and up above under the fingerboard extension that needs to be addressed, that you're not going to catch if you're just playing a fingerboard, at rest. So, it's almost as much up to each guitar that comes in, which is going to be a good candidate for the jig. So I look at the jigs as it's a tool to solve problems for me that are not going to be predictable without it. That's where the magic comes in.
That brings me to like kind of one of my questions about it, which is, when you talk about the rise at the fingerboard extension that happens because of string tension, I mean, that's a lot of like, in my mind, I could be wrong about this, but that's like a lot of body twisting and stuff that's happening under string tension. Do you find that the neck jig is replicating that enough with its kind of pressing up on the neck? Does that do kind of a similar thing that the string tension is doing, or do you sometimes check it up?
It does to the neck. Occasionally you'll get it up in the jig and it's not reacting to you.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, it depends on why all of that stuff is happening. If you're getting the rise in the body, up behind the bridge, and then the dip down in front of the sound hole, and then the rise up again in the shoulders, and it's because you've got loose braces or bridge plate problems and stuff like that, obviously all of that stuff gets fixed first before the frets are ever addressed. But sometimes it depends on the guitar in particular, but sometimes you'll get a guitar that deflects up in the top. And so what we'll do before we jig it is I'll get a scissor jack up underneath the bridge. I'll raise it up so it stays there when I take the strings off of it, and then I can jig it, and the body shape will pretty much stay pretty close. And actually, in those circumstances, that strap that comes with the neck jig, which comes with they do the straps with the new neck jig, and I think they'd sold them with the wooden one too. That's actually where that kind of helps a little bit, because you can tighten that to bring that down in the center while the bridge area is lifted. So it's something that you kind of play with for each guitar. But I find the neck jig does a really good job of getting the neck to reproduce the shape that it had under string tension. But once again, it's just a matter of, I pretty much know when I examine each guitar, when it comes in, that this is going to be a jig job, and other times when it's not, just by being able to take the numbers and do all of those calculations when you first examine the guitar.